I have a little boyfriend, someone so stunningly handsome and endearingly obedient he reminds me of a loyal puppy. But just as I was about to propose, I stumbled upon a startling scene, him at a grand banquet, dressed impeccably in a sharp suit, his face cold and commanding. The crowd flattered him shamelessly, addressing him as the heir to a Manhattan dynasty. Many people assume Louis is my kept little boyfriend. He's 3 years younger than me, with a chiseled, youthful face that exudes innocence. Standing at over 6 feet tall, he looks gentle and non-threatening, a charming mix of boyish good looks and understated elegance. He spends his days clinging to me affectionately, behaving like an adorable, clingy pup. "Baby sister, you're home." The moment I opened the door, Louis whisked off his apron and dashed toward me, pulling me into his embrace. His soft, tousled hair brushed against my shoulder as he buried his head, murmuring in a muffled, spoiled tone, "I missed you so much, baby sister. A whole day without you felt unbearable." My assistant, who was standing nearby, averted her gaze, her expression one of practiced indifference as she placed my briefcase on the shoe rack by the door. "Boss, I'll take my leave now." The diligent worker stepped back, maintaining a neutral face, and quietly shut the door behind her. I chuckled at the sight of Louis's antics, gently rubbing his flushed ear. "Why do you always feel the need to flaunt your affection for me in front of others?" Despite his clingy nature, Louis was prone to bouts of shyness. When we first started dating, even a simple kiss would make his cheeks turn scarlet. Now, his personality hasn't changed, but he's somehow developed this penchant for public displays of affection. Releasing me from his grip, Louis easily scooped me up onto his arm, carrying me effortlessly into the dining room. He lowered his head and nipped at my lips, before murmuring in a sulky tone, "Because you're so amazing, baby sister. I want the whole world to know you're mine." The little puppy drooped his imaginary tail, his big eyes glistening with a pitiful, wounded look. I laughed and ruffled his hair. "You know, I love you the most." Hearing that, the insecure puppy's eyes immediately lit up again, glowing with happiness. He leaned in to shower me with kisses and hugs, clinging to me for a while before finally settling back into his chair, satisfied, as we began to enjoy our meal together. As I chewed over the ever-circulating office gossip, my eyes fell on Louis's bare ring finger. An idea suddenly came to mind. We've been dating for 3 years, living together for 2, and the number of arguments we've had could be counted on one hand. We're as harmonious as an old married couple. Yet, even business partners seem convinced Louis is my kept man, slyly hinting at when I might change tastes. Louis, working from home every day, undoubtedly hears those rumors. It's bound to unsettle him. Maybe I should propose to him? Once the thought took hold, I wasted no time. I secretly instructed my assistant to secure me a spot at the next small auction I could get into. Impatient by nature, I couldn't wait for a custom piece. Why not opt for a well-known masterpiece and get it over with? Conveniently, I heard Manhattan's famed heir, Mr. Scott, would be attending this particular event. The organizers had curated an array of exquisite items to win his favor, though, frankly, most of them were hideous. I claimed I was going on a business trip and moved out of the house. While away, I threw myself into planning the proposal, transforming the new villa I had recently purchased into the perfect setting. On the day of the auction, I even switched cars, making sure Louis wouldn't accidentally spot me outside and ruin the surprise. The auction wasn't particularly large in scale, but thanks to the presence of Mr. Scott, a key figure in Manhattan's elite circles, the turnout was significant. To better accommodate their esteemed guests, the organizers hosted a small pre-auction banquet, offering everyone a chance to network and mingle. Since I had come here with a purpose, I didn't immediately engage with the crowd. Instead, I tucked myself into a quiet corner to study the auction catalog. After mentally marking a few promising pieces, I pulled out my phone to make notes. At that exact moment, a message from Louis popped up on my screen. "Baby sister, when are you coming home? I miss you so much." The text was accompanied by a puppy-eyed emoji. Imagining his adorably pitiful face, my heart softened involuntarily. "I miss you too." "Don't worry, I'll be back soon," I replied, suppressing a smile. I almost added, "And I'll bring you a big surprise," but decided to leave that unsent. Seconds later, he bombarded me with 2 more cutesy emojis of a puppy begging for attention. "I'll wait for you at home." Oh, just look at this. How could anyone resist rushing back to such a sweet boyfriend? In the bustling banquet hall, I bit my lip to keep from grinning too obviously. As I was about to send one last message and put my phone away, a sharp scream pierced through the chatter, drawing everyone's attention. Instinctively shielding my phone, I looked up toward the commotion. And there it was, a face so familiar it left me breathless. My heart stopped. I stood up abruptly, staring intently to confirm I wasn't imagining things. No, my eyes weren't deceiving me. The boyfriend who had just been sending me playful emojis was now standing at the center of the room, dressed in a sleek black suit. He was surrounded by an entourage of admirers treating him like royalty, while a young woman lay on the floor nearby, sobbing inconsolably. His expression was cold, devoid of the gentle harmlessness I knew so well. Instead, he exuded a commanding, untouchable aura that filled the room. The weeping woman on the floor went unnoticed by him, he didn't even spare her a glance. Instead, he looked down indifferently, fiddling with his phone. It was the people around him who spoke up in his defense. "You must be joking. Do you know who this is? This is Mr. Scott. And you dare accuse him of being a creep? Do you have any idea who you've offended?" My mind went blank as I stood frozen in the crowd, staring at Lewis in stunned silence. I'd heard of Vincent Scott before. He was said to be the heir to the Scott family, one of Manhattan's most powerful financial dynasties. In recent years, internal family conflicts had taken a toll on the Scott Corporation, causing their stocks to plummet and their business ventures to falter. Just when everyone was speculating about who might emerge as the next leader of the Scott family, an unexpected figure appeared, a young prodigy who quickly proved to be a genius in the business world. Single-handedly, he had stabilized the family's declining fortunes, reorganized its vast empire, and elevated it to even greater heights. Because of his exceptional talent and reclusive nature, he was revered in elite circles, earning the nickname Lord as a mark of respect and adoration. When I first started navigating the business world, I'd heard his name plenty of times. But since our industries didn't overlap and he guarded his privacy meticulously, I never learned what he looked like or what his full name was. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine he might be someone I already knew. And yet, the Louis I remembered was pure and sincere, like a bright, warm flame. The Vincent Scott I'd heard about was cold, arrogant, and ruthlessly efficient. 2 people with such opposing personalities, it was impossible to reconcile them as one in my mind. Massaging my temples, I decided to test my suspicions. I sent a playful emoji to the little boyfriend, still waiting for my reply. Almost instantly, the phone of the young man at the center of the crowd buzzed with a notification. Well, so much for convincing myself it was just a resemblance. There was no mistaking it. The so-called Mr. Scott was, without a doubt, my boyfriend of 3 years, the same boyfriend I was planning to propose to. From the moment I met Lewis, I'd always thought he was just an ordinary city boy. He had fallen for me at first sight when I gave a speech at my alma mater as an honored graduate. Afterward, he'd snuck backstage, fumbling nervously to ask for my contact information. Back then, he wore a pair of faded jeans and had a shy smile, looking every bit like a freshly graduated, broke college kid. After we got acquainted, he made himself unforgettable with his relentless yet adorable persistence, flooding my social media with messages, writing me heartfelt notes like a lovesick teenager. For 6 months, he pursued me tirelessly. Every day, he'd show up with a bouquet of flowers, and every now and then, he'd drop by my office to bring me lunch, always careful not to disrupt my work. His efforts were the perfect antidote to the emotional void I hadn't realized I had. At the time, I'd just managed to get my company on stable footing, and his sweetness was a welcome relief. Bit by bit, he won me over, and eventually, we naturally fell into a relationship. Lewis rarely talked about his family. On the rare occasions the topic came up, He'd vaguely mentioned that his parents had passed away and his family situation wasn't ideal. I didn't press him for details. My own family wasn't exactly picture perfect, so I figured there was no need to reopen old wounds. If there was something he wanted to share, I trusted he'd tell me when he was ready. But now that his hidden identity had been revealed, I realized this was quite the surprise. I let out a cold laugh. The commotion at the banquet didn't last long. The organizers quickly sent staff to handle the situation. The event manager apologized profusely to Lewis while whispering something into the crying girl's ear. Her face turned ghostly pale, and she scrambled to her feet, stammered an apology, and left the banquet in a hurry. Lewis remained silent throughout, his expression icy, not sparing even a glance at the girl or the people around him. Instead, he kept his head down, staring at his phone like it held the most precious treasure in the world, unwilling to let his attention drift for even a second. It wasn't until the organizer invited him to a private lounge with a group of others that Lewis finally tucked his phone into his suit pocket with visible reluctance. Without so much as a backward glance, he walked off, his posture straight and confident. I glanced at the puppy eye emojis Lewis had sent me on our chat, then back at his retreating figure. Oh, so that's how it is? My sweet little boyfriend has quite the range, doesn't he? Playing this dual-role game with me? I let out a cold chuckle and put my phone away. Lately, I'd been feeling guilty about not spending enough time with him because of my hectic work schedule. But now? Guilty? Guilty for what? Clearly, he's been plenty busy himself. I downed 3, maybe 4 glasses of wine in quick succession, barely managing to suppress the storm of anger roiling in my chest. The brief pre-auction banquet concluded, and the hostesses began guiding guests to their seats. Still simmering with anger, I took a deep breath and double-checked the auction numbers in the VIP section before being ushered into my reserved private box. The auction officially began. I barely glanced at the items being presented on stage. My attention was entirely focused on the movements in the VIP section upstairs. Every time Lewis's private box bid on something, I would immediately raise the price. Whatever he wanted, I wanted too, at least on paper. It didn't take long for the rest of the attendees to pick up on the tension. Whenever either of us entered the bidding fray, no one else dared to intervene unless the item was truly one of a kind. After 7 rounds of driving up Lewis's bids, it seemed they'd finally had enough. A knock sounded at my door. When I called out, the person who stepped in was none other than the event manager I'd seen at the banquet earlier. "Miss Swan," he began, rubbing his hands together awkwardly, his expression caught between politeness and unease. "I hope you can stay calm. This auction is meant to be a light-hearted affair, just a bit of entertainment. There's no need to take it so seriously. Here, please accept this wine as a small token from us." I merely nodded, saying nothing. Wiping at the beads of sweat forming on his forehead, the manager hesitated before continuing. "The bidder in box 88 is Mr. Scott. Perhaps you've heard of him." "Oh, your collection is impressive," I interrupted, my tone flat. "But I didn't bring unlimited cash with me. If the price goes beyond what I find reasonable, I won't buy it." "Isn't that how auctions work?" The manager looked even more conflicted. "Miss Swan, Sighing, I cut him off. "Look, I understand you're in a tough spot trying to please both sides. Don't worry, I'm not here to cause you trouble. Leave the wine, and I promise not to wreck your event." After all, I'd already driven up the price on several items and likely cost Lewis's box a significant amount of money. That was satisfaction enough for now. The fact that they sent the manager down instead of Lewis himself made it clear he had no interest in finding out who was opposing him. He simply wanted to swat away a minor nuisance without spoiling his evening. Fine. There was no point dragging this out further. Better to end it here and let the auction house owe me a favor. The manager visibly relaxed at my words. "Miss Swan, you are one of our most esteemed guests. This is the least we can do." He motioned for staff to bring in 2 more bottles of wine. "I won't take up any more of your time. Enjoy the rest of the evening. I waved him off and leaned back in my seat. For the remainder of the auction, I refrained from bidding on anything, watching as Lewis's box spent lavishly, acquiring item after item like money was no object. As I flipped through the documents my assistant had sent me about Lewis's true identity, my mind churned with conflicting emotions. I'd always prided myself on being decisive, whether in business or relationships. I believed I was the type to cut through complications swiftly and cleanly. But now, with the truth staring me in the face, I found myself hesitating. One thought kept echoing in my head. I can't bear to lose him. Over the years we'd been together, Lewis had proven himself to be the perfect boyfriend, kind, attentive, and unwavering in his devotion. It was as if he'd taken his heart out and placed it in my hands, wholly and unreservedly. I'm not naive. I know how to tell real affection from pretense. And given his background, what could he possibly gain from being with me? The privilege of being sneered at, labeled a gold digger, or ridiculed as a kept man? Unless he had some peculiar fetish for public humiliation, I couldn't imagine what motive he'd have other than love. I've read plenty of those romantic novels before, the kind where the heroine discovers her partner is secretly a powerful mogul. They always seem so delighted, as though it's the ultimate fairy tale. But when it happens in real life, the lack of honesty is infuriating. Lost in thought, I barely noticed when the ring I had my eye on earlier was brought onto the auction stage. I stared at it for a moment, my mind blank. Then, almost as if possessed, I pressed the bidding button. It wasn't until the auctioneer called my number 3 times, slammed the gavel, and declared the item sold that I snapped back to reality. Rubbing my temples, I let out a sigh. Fine. It was a beautiful ring with a romantic meaning, but it didn't have to be a wedding ring. I could always keep it as part of my collection. The auction, small as it was, wrapped up quickly after that. I couldn't muster the energy to examine the ring closely. I simply left my company address for delivery and instructed my assistant to handle the rest. As I stepped out of the banquet hall, debating whether to head home and wait for Lewis to return or call him now for a confrontation, someone blocked my path. So, you're the one who was going against our Mr. Scott just now, huh? A cocky young man with bleached hair, someone who'd been posturing beside Lewis earlier, stood in front of me. He gave me a once-over, clicking his tongue with disdain. I know who you are, Jenny Swan, CEO of that up-and-coming tech company. Before I could respond, he went on, let me guess. You're one of those people trying to pull strings and get close to Mr. Scott. Hoping to latch onto the Scott family's influence, aren't you? Don't bother. People like you should know better than to dream so big. I couldn't help but laugh at his arrogance. Me? Trying to meet Mr. Scott? I'd say it's the other way around, he's the one who should want to meet me. After all, I already knew him. Did I need to stoop to such petty tactics to get his attention? It was obvious this guy wasn't acting on Lewis's orders. He must have taken it upon himself to deal with me, hoping to win favor with his boss. But I was already in a foul mood, and his words tipped me over the edge. I decided to channel my frustration with Lewis into this little encounter. So, Mr. Scott likes to role-play, does he? Fine. If he's going to put on a show, I'll act right along with him. Smiling sweetly, I reached out to pat the guy on the head. Don't worry. When the time comes, your precious Mr. Scott will be the one begging to meet me. Before he could respond with whatever self-important lecture he had prepared, I slipped into the car my driver had been holding open and left the venue without another word. I stayed away for a few more days, before finally heading home. The apartment Lewis and I shared was a spacious penthouse that he'd chosen. He'd claimed at the time that it was a long-term rental and had refused my offer to split the costs, insisting he'd been able to afford it after selling the rights to one of his novels. Looking back now, it was probably his apartment all along, not a rental. When I pressed my thumb to the fingerprint scanner and unlocked the door, the familiar figure darted toward me immediately. Baby, I missed you so much. Lewis took my bag from my hand and tried to pull me into a hug. You said you'd be back days ago. Did something happen to delay you? I stepped aside, avoiding his embrace. During the days I spent away, my mind had been a chaotic mess, filled with spiraling thoughts. I'd gone through all our old messages, replayed every memory from the day we met to now, dissecting every interaction we'd had. But the more I thought about it, the more tangled my emotions became. Because of my parents' troubled marriage, honesty, at least relative honesty, has always been my bottom line when it comes to love. I thought seeing Louis again would make me furious or leave me overwhelmed with some other negative emotion. But when he came over to hug me, only one thought filled my mind. I was angry, yes. But I also missed him. My work ran into some issues, things got a little messy, I said wearily, massaging my temples as I brushed past Louis to kick off my shoes and settle on the couch. Left without the usual welcome hug, Louis froze by the door for a long moment before slowly shuffling over to sit on the edge of the sofa like a hesitant puppy. "Baby sister," he drawled, trailing off expectantly. I pretended not to hear him. I'd thought that after seeing him in his cold, commanding persona, the center of attention in that crowd, it would feel strange to see him acting vulnerable again. But as I looked at him now, tail metaphorically tucked and his expression full of pitiful hesitation, I found myself taking deep breaths to stop my hand from instinctively reaching out to ruffle his hair. I was supposed to be angry, damn it. Habits really are a killer. Forcing myself to look away, I sighed. By the way, I have this friend who recently did something I can't understand. Louis blinked, his face showing a flicker of surprise at my change in topic. But he didn't linger on it. Noticing me rubbing my temples, he moved closer and gently guided me to lie back against his legs. His hands began massaging the pressure points on my head with practiced care. "What did they do?" he asked, his head lowered. "She hid her family background from the person she liked for years. Can you believe that? What do you think she was thinking?" Louis's hands paused for a brief moment. "Maybe she thought it wasn't the right time to be honest?" I narrowed my eyes. "What's so bad about being honest? She's from a good family, she's good-looking, wealthy, and powerful." Louis fell silent for a beat before suddenly letting out a soft chuckle. "I'm not sure either. Maybe she didn't say anything at first, and later it just got harder to bring it up." His slender fingers moved from my forehead to my cheeks, gently massaging as his gaze met mine. In his beautiful eyes, I could see my own reflection staring back at me. "You're not hiding anything from me, are you?" I asked abruptly. His hands froze mid-motion. "Jenny," he murmured, lowering his forehead to press lightly against mine. "I would never lie to you. But withholding the truth? That was a different story." Thinking back, Louis had always been vague about his background. He never outright lied, but I'd been foolish enough not to press him for details. Just as he was leaning in for a kiss, I pinched his cheeks, stopping him in his tracks. "All right, enough. I just got home and I'm exhausted. I'm going to take a shower." Over the next few weeks, I stopped testing Louis altogether. Coincidentally, work at the office picked up, giving me a convenient excuse to throw myself into my job and, occasionally, sleep at the company. Louis was smart enough to catch on if I pushed too hard or too often. At some point, subtle probing stops being subtle and starts feeling like an outright interrogation. And I've never been good at acting. The more I let passive aggressiveness creep into my words and actions, the more awkward I felt, even to myself. Besides, this game wasn't one I could let end so quickly. Fortunately, Louis completely believed my excuse about being on a business trip, never suspecting that I had stayed in the city the entire time. Even though he had some doubts about my recent behavior, it didn't cross his mind that I might have witnessed the moment his cover was blown. One evening, while I was working late at the office, I had just sent a few messages to some business contacts when my assistant suddenly called me. "Boss." Her hesitant tone immediately put me on alert. "Could you come downstairs for a moment? There's a bit of a situation." Confused, I headed downstairs. The moment I stepped out of the elevator, I was greeted by the sight of Louis, his face flushed and red, blocking my assistant in the hallway. Does Jenny not like me anymore? Is she annoyed with me and doesn't want to see me? Am I just doing everything wrong, and that's why she hates me now? His words were slurred, thick with the smell of alcohol, as he bombarded my assistant with question after question. The second she saw me, her face lit up like she'd been saved. She quickly nudged Louis to turn around. Jenny's here. Louis didn't move. Even his posture screamed disbelief. You're lying. She's been avoiding me, even staying at the office, to dodge me. There's no way she'd come down. I stepped closer and said firmly, Louis, stop bothering Lily. She's trying to finish her work and head home. Startled, Louis turned around. The moment his bleary eyes focused on me, he staggered forward and threw himself into my arms. My assistant, clearly relieved, shot me a grateful look before slipping away as fast as her heels would carry her. In the quiet, empty lobby of the office building, it was just me and a drunken Louis. Jenny, my Jenny, I love you, he mumbled over and over, his arms locked tightly around my waist as though terrified I'd vanish if he let go. Yet despite his repeated declarations of love, he didn't say much else, just my name, again and again, like a chant. I patted his back. You've had quite a bit to drink. Because I feel like something's wrong with you lately, he muttered against my shoulder. You've been distant. You won't let me get close, and you're barely home anymore. I know you always have your reasons, but I can't help feeling uneasy. His grip tightened slightly around my waist. Jenny, are you leaving me? I sighed. I'm not leaving you. I don't hate you. And I haven't fallen for anyone else either. I really am just busy. I ran a soothing hand down his back. If you don't believe me, come upstairs and look at the reports in my office. There's a company bringing in new technology from abroad, and they want to collaborate with me. I've been so swamped with work I can barely breathe. His head shot up. Really? Louis was ridiculously easy to pacify. Just one sentence, and the gloomy look on his face vanished, replaced by a bright, joyful smile. Like a puppy that had been fretting over losing its owner. I rubbed his reddened ear, my expression complicated. After a bit more coaxing and a lot of slurred words on his part, I managed to get him into the elevator and up to the office. In the end, he'd drunk far too much. Even after I settled him into the office lounge, he wouldn't stop muttering and clinging to me, absolutely refusing to let go. Left with no choice, I abandoned my unfinished work and stayed by his side. At some point, as he mumbled and held on to me, I must have fallen asleep too. The next morning, I instinctively reached out to the side of the bed, only to find it empty. Rubbing my eyes, I walked out of the lounge and found Louis sitting in my office chair, staring blankly at the documents on my desk. You're awake? He stood up, walking over to smooth down my messy, sleep-tousled hair. What do you want for breakfast? I'll go get it. I glanced at the desk. Were you looking at my new project? Isn't it amazing? The project was in a niche artificial intelligence field that had gained traction abroad in recent years. I'd had my eye on it for a while, so when they approached me for collaboration, I was genuinely thrilled. I'd avoided discussing these topics with Louis before, thinking he wouldn't understand and it might create awkward silences. But now, I was curious to see what excuse he'd come up with to brush it off. Louis wrapped his arms around me, swaying us gently. Baby sister, I don't know much about these things, but doesn't it seem a little too perfect? You've wanted this for so long, and now the opportunity just falls into your lap. Maybe you should look over the contract again? I smiled at him. You've never done business before, so you wouldn't know. Sometimes I really am just this lucky. And what, you don't trust my judgment? I teased. Louis lowered his gaze, his eyes glistening. Of course I trust your judgment. I just think it's better to be cautious. I ruffled his hair and changed the subject. I want spaghetti bolognese. Seeing that I wasn't taking his concerns seriously, Louis became visibly anxious. In the days that followed, he frequently dropped hints about my project, urging me to reconsider. When that didn't work, he escalated to throwing little tantrums, trying to convince me not to collaborate with the company. Each time, I dismissed him with a simple, "You wouldn't understand," as though I hadn't heard a word he said. As the partnership with the company grew closer, even the contract signing date was finalized. That's when Lewis could no longer sit idly by. First, the Scott Group suddenly stepped in to compete for investment rights with my company. Then came rumors that they were planning to expand aggressively into the tech sector. Despite the mounting pressure, I refused to back down. At home, Lewis often seemed on the verge of saying something, but would always hesitate and change the subject when I looked at him directly. When the tech company showed signs of reconsidering our deal and began courting other potential collaborators, I personally visited their office, offering to cut our profit margins by another 10%. I was determined to secure this partnership. The company, torn between multiple offers, decided to hold a bidding process involving several smaller firms. But I knew Lewis wouldn't let it get that far. The day before the bidding was scheduled, I brought my assistant to the tech company's headquarters. The office was unusually quiet, and it didn't take me long to locate the meeting room. Pushing the door open, I found him immediately. Lewis sat on the sofa, his head lowered as he examined a document with a cold, detached expression. His face was devoid of warmth, exuding an icy authority that matched every image I'd ever had of a decisive, calculating leader. But when he looked up and saw me standing there, his entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The sharp, unapproachable exterior crumbled, replaced by visible surprise and panic, as though he'd been caught red-handed. "Jenny," Lewis called out, his voice trembling. I was just. Gone was the calm and composed figure I had seen moments ago. His expression was now tinged with panic and uncertainty. "This company has issues, I was just trying to." I didn't respond to him immediately. Instead, I turned my gaze to the tech company's manager, who was now standing frozen. "Bringing in outdated foreign tech that's already been deemed useless, hoping to scam people?" I said with a smile. "Did you really think I'd fall for it?" I gestured toward the sound of approaching police sirens outside. "You can explain everything to the cops in a moment." As the police swarmed in and began escorting the manager and his accomplices out, Lewis opened his mouth to say something but ultimately remained silent. In that instant, he understood what I had done. I wasn't unaware of the company's flaws. From the very beginning, I had no intention of partnering with them. This entire charade was staged, for one purpose: to force Lewis to reveal himself and step into the spotlight. It was, in truth, a simple trap. On a normal day, with his usual composure, Lewis would have seen through it and stayed out of it. But this time, he'd been rattled. After I assured the officers I would cooperate with their investigation later, Lewis dismissed the people he had brought with him, leaving the room quiet and just the two of us. He hesitated as he reached out to take my hand but stopped short, pulling back as though afraid. It was almost hard to believe this was the same man rumored to be decisive and ruthless. At this moment, he seemed anything but. "When did you find out?" he finally asked. I smiled. "Find out what?" "That I was being played for a fool?" He paused, his voice quieter. "Or that your sweet, obedient Lewis is actually the infamous Mr. Scott?" Lewis looked genuinely distressed. "I'm sorry, baby sister. I didn't mean to keep it from you." "But you still did," I said evenly. "You kept it from me for 3 years." For someone as skilled and calculating as him, it was impossible to believe he hadn't suspected I might uncover the truth at some point. And yet, he had waited until the situation forced him to confront it. "Did you think I'd start sucking up to your family once I knew your identity? That I'd be blinded by greed?" I asked, voicing the insecurities I had wrestled with during my sleepless nights. "Baby sister, no." He grabbed my arm, his grip firm but pleading. "I fell for you the moment I saw you, that's real. Everything I've felt for you over these years has been real. Aside from my family's identity, I've never hidden anything else from you, nor have I ever lied to you." I stayed silent, and the anxiety in his eyes deepened. "A few years ago, during the family power struggle, there were people who wanted me dead, Lewis explained earnestly. I had no choice but to stay in the shadows and fight from there. I've never been in love before, Jenny. You're the first person I've ever cared about this much. At the beginning, I didn't tell you because I didn't want you dragged into the mess. But as time went on, I genuinely didn't know how to bring it up anymore. The longer I kept it hidden, the more scared I became of losing you if I told the truth. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tight knot in my chest loosen slightly. At least the past 3 years hadn't been a waste. In terms of our feelings for each other, we'd both been honest. I know you truly care about me, I said, patting his head gently. Otherwise, the moment I saw you at the auction, I would have ended things right then. When I first realized he had hidden so much from me, I'd considered every possibility, except breaking up with him. But staying together didn't mean I wasn't angry. At the very least, there was something I needed Lewis to understand. When a partner keeps secrets, it causes anxiety, frustration, and fear. I've never been a fragile flower needing shelter, and I don't want anyone deciding what's best for me without my input. So even if others thought I was overreacting, I had to make it clear, this was my boundary. Lewis, you and I are both independent adults, I said firmly. If my payback for your secrecy feels like too much, then figure out how you want to deal with it. Whatever you decide, I'll cooperate. Lewis pressed his lips into a thin line. I understand. The day after everything unfolded, I temporarily moved out of the apartment Lewis and I shared. He didn't suggest any solutions, nor did he bring up the possibility of breaking up. Instead, he simply sent me daily messages, polite check-ins, without offering excuses or defending himself. Still angry, I didn't reply to a single one. After setting that trap for Lewis and retaliating for his secrecy, I spent nearly a week cooling off. Only then did the anger begin to fade. It wasn't until that point that I started to wonder, had we broken up? Judging by how flustered he was when I confronted him, whether we officially said it or not seemed irrelevant. The thought left me feeling a bit sad, though I couldn't bring myself to regret what I'd done. After work one evening, I aimlessly drove around the city, eventually finding myself outside the hotel where I had planned to propose. Sitting there in the fully decorated proposal setup, I stared at it for a long time, unable to bring myself to dismantle it. Forget it, I thought. Keeping a hotel room rented long-term isn't a big deal. I'll leave it as it is, and deal with it later when I'm in a better mood. I wandered through the city in my car, debating whether to call someone to grab a drink with me. Then, out of nowhere, a pedestrian tapped on my window. Rolling it down, I saw a kind-looking middle-aged woman holding a single rose. Someone asked me to give this to you, she said with a smile. A very handsome young man. Lewis's face immediately flashed in my mind. But it was just a single rose, no message, no note, and nothing on the chat app. After thanking the woman, I watched her stroll away from my car. I stepped out and circled the area, scanning for any sign of Lewis, but he was nowhere to be found. Someone tapped me on the shoulder, and when I turned around, I found the cocky blonde guy from before standing in front of me, sporting a black eye. Miss Swan, he said with a sheepish grin, holding out a bouquet of roses. This is from someone who asked me to deliver it to you. He scratched the back of his head awkwardly. Miss Swan, about before. I was wrong, okay? I shouldn't have said all that nonsense. It was my mistake, please don't hold it against me. His face scrunched up apologetically. I shouldn't have accused you of trying to climb the social ladder. I swear, I wasn't trying to be mean. I was just trying to help Mr. Scott by taking care of things for him. He hesitated before adding, and, that day at the auction? The only reason he went was because the host mentioned they had some rare jewelry with romantic meanings. He wanted to buy something for you. That caught me off guard. I had been so focused on messing with him that I hadn't even paid attention to what he bought. Seeing the guy's pathetic state, I couldn't help but chuckle. All right, I get it. Hearing my laugh, he looked like he'd been granted a pardon. Without waiting for me to ask further questions, he bolted away, disappearing from sight in an instant. I searched through the roses he handed me, but there was no note, no message. My phone remained silent. At this point, I was genuinely confused about what Louis was trying to do. I lingered there for a bit longer until a third person carrying roses entered my line of sight. It was my assistant, Lily. She had requested time off yesterday evening, so I hadn't expected to see her, especially since she had a strict policy of not answering work-related calls during her vacations. "Boss," she panted, out of breath, as she presented an enormous bouquet of roses. Even though Mr. Scott showing off his affection all the time is a little annoying, I still love seeing a gorgeous couple together. Her face flushed as she spoke. "I'm just delivering these for him, but don't worry, I totally respect your choices. No moral pressure at all. Whether you accept him or not, I just want you to be happy." I looked at her quietly. You know, Louis having a better identity should have made me happy, right? Don't you think I'm overreacting? Lily wiped the sweat off her forehead. It doesn't matter what he was hiding, he still messed up. Taking responsibility and apologizing is the least he can do, right? Besides, this is between the two of you. But, if you ask me, he's crazy about you. He clearly doesn't think there's anything wrong with how you've handled things so far. She waved her hands dismissively. Okay, mission complete. I'm going back to enjoy my vacation now. With that, Lily cheerfully waved goodbye and skipped off, leaving me alone again. This time, tucked inside the massive bouquet, I found a small piece of paper folded into the shape of a puppy's head. Unfolding it, I discovered a love letter. The content was identical to the very first letter Louis had written to me when he pursued me, except for one addition at the end. A puppy is always a puppy, and he will love you forever. So, he really does know that I've always thought of him as a puppy. In the days that followed, I received gifts and love letters from Louis almost every day. However, he never appeared in person. His messages on the phone were sparse as well, brief and to the point. Instead, he flaunted the Scott family name everywhere, making sure everyone knew that Mr. Scott was currently reflecting on his mistakes and working to win back his girlfriend. I didn't respond to his gestures, nor did he press to clarify our relationship. Instead, he patiently and earnestly revisited the steps he'd taken when he first pursued me, placing all the control over our relationship firmly in my hands. It wasn't long before my alma mater's annual anniversary celebration came around again, and I accepted an invitation from my former professors to give a speech as a distinguished graduate. On the day of the event, my car broke down, causing me to arrive at the school later than planned. Slipping into the auditorium quietly, I glanced up, and there he was. Louis stood on stage, delivering a speech. The icy demeanor he often displayed in public was softened, and a warm smile spread across his face as his eyes met mine. Following his gaze, the students noticed me and immediately erupted into teasing whispers and chuckles. Even after I took my seat, the commotion didn't die down. Louis's speech was nearing its conclusion. The student host stepped forward, microphone in hand, and asked the scripted question on their list. If your dream as a student was to elevate your family's company, what would you say is your dream now, having achieved that success? Louis thought for a moment before replying with a faint smile. Does wanting to be my lover's loyal puppy count? The auditorium, already abuzz, exploded into laughter and applause. Students turned in their seats, all looking at me to gauge my reaction. Honestly, what nonsense were they encouraging? I couldn't help but laugh, covering my face with one hand as I stifled the sound. Leaning toward the faculty seated beside me, I quietly apologized for the disruption. Fortunately, Louis didn't push his antics further. He smoothly steered the topic back to the original subject of his speech. From my seat in the audience, I raised my head to watch him closely under the stage lights. Rumors may paint him as ruthless and prideful in business, but at his core, Louis was exactly as he appeared when he was with me, bright, warm, and unyielding, like an eternal flame. When Louis finished, it was my turn to take the stage. As I stepped up, I noticed Louis sitting where I had been earlier, tilting his head back to look at me, mimicking my posture. For a moment, I was struck by the memory of our first meeting, when I had glanced casually across the audience and noticed this outrageously good-looking young man for the first time. Following the script I'd prepared, I delivered my speech as planned. At the end, the student host, still in high spirits, asked me the same question they had posed to Lewis. "And what is your dream now?" I paused, thinking for a moment. "My dream is for everything to go smoothly," I replied with a small smile. The students below looked up at me, their expressions a mix of understanding and curiosity. As I stepped off the stage, Lewis was already waiting for me backstage. Somehow, he'd managed to find and change into the outfit he'd worn the first time we met. Standing there with a shy smile, he held out his phone to stop me. "My name is Vincent Scott, current CEO of the Scott Group," he said, his ears turning red as he handed me a letter. "Can I get to know you?" I took the letter and opened it. It was another freshly written love letter. "Do you ever try anything new?" I teased, half laughing. "All you ever do is write love letters, send flowers, and bring food." Lewis answered earnestly, "Because I love you so much, nothing ever feels good enough. But at the same time, I feel like I have to do something." I slipped the letter into my pocket. "Such sweet talk." His grin widened. Then, "Has baby sister been charmed by my sweet talk?" "Barely," I replied, feigning disinterest. "But it's quite unfortunate, I'm a CEO too, and a very ambitious one at that. If you're expecting me to become some dutiful housewife for the sake of love, I'm afraid that's not going to happen." "Perfect," he said without missing a beat. "That makes us a great match." "You don't need to change yourself," Lewis continued. "Baby sister just needs to do what makes her happy. And if someone has to take care of the home, I'm more than willing to take that role." He smiled, a hint of warmth in his expression. "To be honest, I never had much ambition in business anyway. The only reason I've held on to it for so long was to fulfill my mother's dying wish." After a moment of thought, he added, "If you want kids, we'll have them. If you don't, we won't. Whatever you want, I'll make it happen." "And if I wanted your family business?" I joked. Without hesitation, Lewis laughed. "I've already told you, I'm happy to be your loyal puppy. Whatever baby sister wants, I'll give it to her. As long as I'm here, whatever you want to do, I'll help you." If I were someone with no moral compass, with Lewis's utterly smitten state, he might even help me bury bodies if I asked. Looking back, this whole unmasking incident seemed to condense all the fights and frustrations we'd never had in the years we'd been together. It created a clear dividing line. If we could get past this, everything would be smooth sailing. If not, we'd go our separate ways. But as I hesitated at the edge of the shore, the person beside me had already crossed over, waiting for me with his heart in plain sight, the very heart I'd once doubted. "Are you this gentle and obedient with everyone else, too?" I asked with a laugh. "Where do all those devilish rumors about you come from?" Lewis smiled. "I'm only like this with baby sister." Taking my hand in his, he lowered his head slightly. Behind him, his metaphorical tail wagged happily. "After that day, I looked into baby sister's schedule," he admitted. "I found out you went to the auction to buy a ring, to propose to me." His eyes sparkled as his lips curved into a playful smile. "So, baby sister, when will you let me become your one and only loyal puppy?" The end.